timing, well done.
Almost done.
Yeah, just grab one of these, or that one where there's double. Nice to see you, Ricardo.
Nice to see you again.
Are you ready to go? Exactly. No. What I'm going to do is just Gentlemen, good morning everybody, and welcome to our session on the avoidance and mitigation of impacts to the marine environment. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you today. This session is going to involve a couple of speakers, well, a panel of 4 actually. One is going to join us remotely, and I will be taking you through a bit of an introductory session to start with. We do have people joining us remotely, so if you've got your headsets, please wear them. And remotely, we are taking questions, so if you want to join us, that'll be fine. I'm going to take my mask off now. Good, here we go. So, our very esteemed panel will include Doug Novacek, who will join us remotely, as I said, Mark Johnson from BP, Ricardo Tame from the Biodiversity Consultancy, and Isabel Hoffman from the Capitals Coalition. To start off with, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Fauna and Flora International's involvement in the impact mitigation in the marine environment. Then our speakers will talk, and then we'll have an opportunity for a panel discussion. So to start with, just to frame FFI's involvement in this is really, and our concerns around the impacts of development and infrastructure, but actually all sorts of different activities in the marine environment. We've, over the last couple of years, produced a couple of big documents, really, which have been to guide the application of the mitigation hierarchy, so the avoidance, minimization, restoration, and offsetting, where needed, sort of processes and protocols and approaches in the marine environment for the oil and gas sector. This involved the IFC, a number of bankers, so lender consultants, but also consulted with the oil and gas sector itself. So it's an important reference, so that's available online just in case you want to. But the key to this is really about the alignment of the mitigation hierarchy, an objectives-led framework. So an objective-led framework means that we're either looking for a mitigation of no harm, to achieve no net loss, or to achieve net positive impact. And working towards the IFC's net gain outcome, for example, is one of the objectives that was set out. So how do you apply different activities to achieve these? It's not so easy. The other is an assessment of the risks and impacts of seabed mining to the marine environment too. Again, taking a strategic environmental assessment approach through the mitigation hierarchy to see what is possible when these impacts are expected on this anticipated industry. Now, the importance of approaching mitigation and avoidance of impacts in the marine environment needs to take into account the complexity, the connectivity, the remarkable three-dimensional dynamic state of the ocean. So if we look at the composition, structure, and function, these are sort of critical questions that we have to ask. You know, how much data do we need? What questions do we need to ask ourselves in order to understand the baseline? What's the spatial and temporal scale that we should be looking at? And what are the indicators? How do we begin to understand what our baseline is? How do we understand our impacts? And then identify mitigation actions. So not an easy task to set ourselves, but this is what we're hoping our panel will help us address today. Just looking at the good practice guidance for the oil and gas sector, light. So, and the same as being applied to the other publication, and it's really looking at who the users of the lands of our seascapes are, who what kind of baselines you need, what are the anticipated impacts, so that we can systematically start to address these through the mitigation hierarchy to that objective I mentioned. So it's all there. We just don't have that many projects in practice at the moment to actually really deliver and demonstrate that we've been able to achieve these. There's also questions around how effective restoration options may be in the marine environment. There is a big question around whether or not offsetting is achievable in the marine environment. Certainly, when it comes to deep oceans, those are two things that are eliminated immediately from the whole mitigation hierarchy. It's impossible in the deep ocean, sort of 6,000 meters, to actually mitigate or offset. So how one approaches this and brings that early stage of avoidance and minimization into play is one of the most critical parts of this. So just let's look at this context of the marine. Why are we looking at this? We have a very oceans contain a large variety of ecosystems. We've got close shore stuff that we're dealing with. We've got coastal developments. We've got activities taking in the global commons of the deep ocean. We've got others going on in the economic zones of countries, so the jurisdictional responsibilities are very different sometimes. But equally, we know that the ocean is incredibly important, not just for human use values and the fisheries and how many people are being fed by our oceans, but also for the regulation and the and essentially the planetary processes around climate change, important for regulating climate. We heard recently in a number of papers that have come out of the impacts of seabed trawling, for example, on climate mitigation potential of the ocean. So if you trawl and you release sediments, you're starting to release carbon. And so there are lots of things that are in terms of the ecosystem services the ocean provides. This is not new to anybody. When we look at SDG 14 around life in the water, it's really rather depressing looking at how badly we've done in achieving the goals that we set ourselves 10 years ago, or 11 years ago now. We're talking about, putting 30% of the ocean under protection, some increase in protected areas for sure, but there has been an enormous increase of, runoff from agricultural systems and production landscapes, climate change, leading to coral reef bleaching and destruction. We've got noise pollution that's coming in from increased volumes of shipping. Just if you go through them all, it's just every single one of them. Over-harvesting of fisheries, lots of stuff being put in, too much coming out, not enough it's being dealt with on plastics pollution. So how do we attend to this around the avoidance and mitigation of impacts to our marine environment? So conserving marine species and ecosystems really needs to be coordinated too. So this is part of the whole alloxany thing, this whole connection, the ridge to reef theories, the fact that our terrestrial environments are not separate from our marine environments. So what we do on land very often has implications to what happens in the marine environment. So I'm going to pick up just on this theme, only because we've got a big motion running and we'll be voting here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of one of the projects FFI's been working on, and that's related to Motion 69, and just some of the impacts of stuff that you probably haven't heard about. Before I do that, just to say that FFI, is working with a number of companies on marine and the mitigation of marine environments towards net positive impact, and certainly the alignment with the IFC's Performance Standard 6. So looking at net gain or net positive impact objectives. And these are oil and gas projects, but also coastal port development, as well as some of the offshore mining, shallow water mining around the coasts, southern African coasts. And so we're facing all of these challenges. Stepping into the deep ocean, however, we've got these two reports, one of which I have next to me here, which is that one I pointed out at the beginning, is really taking a look at this in a very systematic way. And what we're trying to do is to understand the landscape, or at least the seascape, understand the complexity, and understand where the gaps are. So what kind of science is needed in order to fill those, which reflects to how much we ask of our clients or our partner organizations. And the big question is, how much information do we need in order to make good decisions about what kind of actions can then be taken around the avoidance and minimization and mitigation of our activities? What we do know in the deep ocean environment is that it's incredibly complex. There's not very much known, but also that the types of activities that are proposed to be taking place will have catastrophic impacts on climate regulation, the whole sort of nutrient trace metal processes and stabilization and stasis in the ocean. It will impact very rare and unique ecosystems too. So there could be extinctions, and certainly would disrupt, as does seabed trawling, the very content and process of the ecosystem. This is an industry which is far spread across our oceans. It's happening in every ocean along the tectonic plates. We've got three typologies. There's the polymetallic nodules, which is essentially large lumps of rocks about the size of potatoes, which are ecosystems in themselves. They have very complex microbial systems associated with them. They take tens of millions of years to form and are actually living systems. So the analogy we make is, if you remove these to make batteries, which is what it's all about, cobalt, manganese, and copper and whatever's in them, are being touted as just perfect for making our electric vehicle batteries. If you remove those, you're moving ecosystems. You are essentially making batteries out of a living system, as you would cement out of a living coral reef system. So that's the analogy. But the other is these extraordinary cobalt-rich crusts, which are found on seamounts, which are hotspots of biodiversity in the oceans and really important to our whole ocean ecosystem. And the other is polysulfides and these hydrothermal vent systems. So that's what a polymetallic nodule looks like, and that is the 19 concessions that have been offered and taken up in the Pacific Ocean in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. This area, if you overlaid it with America, would go from coast to coast. Each concession is 75,000 square kilometers. At least would be in the first operational, or at least seabed, exploitation process per license. No license has been given yet, but they're all out there exploring right now. So the point is that companies are starting to get in there. They're starting to use the narrative to look at how we decarbonize our economies, where do we get minerals and metals from, and it's just to alert that it's not all that straightforward, because when you're in those depths, in that complexity, out in the high seas, in the global commons, how do you govern this industry, but also how do you begin to avoid and mitigate your impacts? These are the types of machines that would be used for certainly the polymetallic sulfides and the cobalt crusts on seabed mounts, on seamounts. So they're not small, nor are they going to be lacking in impact. That's just what I was saying. So we don't know that much. We need a lot more science. We know the importance. And I'll flash through these very quickly, is that we know what we've identified and managed to essentially define the type of impacts that we expect. Finding mitigation is impossible, because we can avoid, yes, we can minimize certainly by bringing in new technologies, designing technology to actually meet the objective of a net positive or no harm objective. But there is a lot to think about. We know that there is no restoration potential apart from passive restoration, which I think is something that we need to think about. If passive restoration can happen in you know, a 2-year, 20-year, 50-year horizon, that's great. If it takes geological timeframes, perhaps it's not an acceptable one. So looking at the space and the tolerance that we have in our systems to actually absorb those types of analogies is important. I'm going to just look at this because of the urgency of why we need to attend to this type of industry. Things are moving fast, and in each of our sectors, we know that things are transforming. So the oil and gas sector, the energy sector is transforming to new methodologies, new typologies, but there'll be new impacts coming in. And if we think about our supply chains, this is one of the things we have to think about. Right. I think this is time now to just acknowledge the input of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, which is looking into this, and the fact that they are leading with FFI this call for a moratorium, just to think about it, because should we progress with activities that we know will have a permanent, long-lasting impacts? Right. It gives me great pleasure now. Hopefully that wasn't too depressing, because that's one of those industries which, you know, is hard to mitigate, but we know that there are very many activities that are happening within our marine environment that are, you know, mitigable, and certainly, you know, can be managed in a very constructive way. And identifying opportunities for offsets and for increasing our protected areas within the marine environment are important. We have to look potentially with a nature positive lens and identify and perhaps be more tolerant of the sort of out of kind and the equivalencies aspects of the mitigation hierarchy when we're looking on the compensation side of things. So I'm just going to put that out there so that you can start to think about it. So what do we need to do? How do we approach this? And what is possible? So I'm going to hand over to Doug, who's going to come in remotely. Thanks very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today about ocean noise, some of its potential and realized impacts, and then some ideas for monitoring and particularly for mitigation of various noise sources. Just wanted to say hello, and now I will share my screen and get started. Go full screen. Great. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. And I am a professor at Duke University in the US in the School of the Environment and in the School of Engineering. And my focus is on marine conservation technology. And I spend quite a lot of time thinking about working on and trying to find solutions to the impacts of anthropogenic ocean noise. So today I just wanted to start with a quick primer on ocean noise and sound in the ocean, starting with why is it so important and such an important sensory modality for animals in the ocean. Then I'll just briefly introduce the anthropogenic noise sources, talk about some of the demonstrated as well as potential effects and impacts, and then focus some time on mitigation and management efforts. Okay, so why is sound so important? This slide is it's a little bit busy, so I apologize, but just to introduce, along the x-axis we see frequency, or people think of it as pitch, but it's frequency in hertz. And what you see are the red, the sources coded in red are anthropogenic ones, for the most part. The light blue are mammals. The green are other animals, and then the blue generally are darker blue are naturally occurring sources. A couple things to notice here that are important are the overlap in frequency. So just for reference, our hearing goes from about 100 hertz or so out to 20 kilohertz, 20 hertz or so out to 20 kilohertz. So this is our hearing range, but you can see that things like bowhead whales and humpback whales and blue and fin whales hear at a much lower frequency. And then the dolphins and porpoises, in fact, get out much higher. But the important things to take away from this are the overlap in frequency between and among some of the animals and some of the human sources, shipping, sonar, seismic air guns, etc. Then the other thing that's quite important is the level, and that's the y-axis, the amplitude or the loudness of those sounds. And you can see that, relatively speaking, the human sources are louder than the animal sources. And this is important, of course, if they're right next to each other, but also sound travels extremely well in the ocean. My apologies. Sound travels extremely well in the ocean. So those low frequency sources in particular can travel quite far. Okay, so the overlap in frequency and then also the loudness of those things are important factors to take away from this slide. Next, this just gets to the point of how well sound travels in the ocean. It's a long history, but behind this experiment, but some physical and acoustical oceanographers had the idea, they wondered whether we could hear a sound around the world, and indeed, the sound source in this experiment was played at Heard Island in the South Indian Ocean. And it was a coded sequence of sounds that was played at a particular time, and there were all those red dots that you see are all listening stations around the world. And indeed, that sequence of sounds was heard at all of these stations. The blue lines do not indicate necessarily the mode of travel, but the sounds were heard minutes later, seconds to minutes later, depending on how far away the source was. So the takeaway from this is that a sound source, this was cleverly placed to maximize the transmission, but nonetheless, those sounds, the low frequency sounds in particular, travel exceedingly well through the ocean. And I'm happy to try and answer questions on that during the session if that's possible. The other takeaway from this is if we are able to broadcast and detect sounds at these kinds of distances, even if not all the way around the world, but even from the South Indian Ocean to Cape Point, for example, is quite a distance, or Ascension Island, then the potential is certainly there for animals to communicate over those types of distances, mostly the large animals at low frequencies, but nonetheless, the potential is there. Okay, moving along. What is happening with noise in the ocean? This is a somewhat old graph at this point, but the trends have continued from 1950s out to past 2010. These are recordings off Southern California. And what we see is an increase of 10 decibels. And the 10 decibels might not sound like a lot, and I should have pointed this out earlier. Decibels are on a logarithmic scale, so every 10 dB is an order of magnitude. And so what we see is an increase of 3 decibels per decade, which again doesn't sound like much, but on a logarithmic scale, it is quite substantial. And these trends have continued. More so in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere, but that's primarily because of source number one. And these are the 3 primary sources of anthropogenic sound in the ocean. Not the only ones by any means, but the ones that are producing the most energy into the ocean. Shipping, large vessels plying the ocean, generating noise into the ocean that travels exceedingly well through the ocean. Seismic, primarily seismic air guns that are used for research, for exploration for oil and gas, and then in other contexts as well. But it's a very good tool for probing the substrate and in the ocean and down into the substrate. And then sonar gets a lot of press partially because of the frequency range, and it overlaps with some animals that turn out to be quite sensitive to it. But there are also lots of kinds of sonars that I'll point out. The military ones are the ones that get a lot of press because of the overlap and the relationship with strandings. But think about every boat out on the water that has a depth sounder on it has a sonar of sorts. And so those are all producing sound into the ocean as well. Okay, next is just one slide, and I realize this is very short, and I'm happy to answer questions or field questions later. These impacts are in order of likelihood or prevalence, behavioral disruption, and we particularly are concerned about critical behaviors like feeding and nursing. And these are demonstrated in many contexts. And I should say that there are contexts under which the animals don't show any response. And it's important to factor those in as we discuss this and talk about mitigation, because if we have information that tells us that a particular sound at a particular time is not causing any kind of disruption, then we should not spend any time trying to mitigate it. On the other hand, we have lots of examples of disruption of behavior in association with noise sources. Next is physiological. The elevation of stress hormones, for example, is something that has come onto the scene relatively late, but is certainly something of concern. I'll say that there are certainly some demonstrated elevation in stress hormones around the time of noise exposure. Stress is an interesting physiological response. A little bit of stress is not bad. What is bad is chronic stress from chronic noise exposure, which is very well documented in mammals. Noise, sound, unlike smell, which we are able to eventually ignore if we're exposed to the same thing over and over again. However, noise, the whole time that it's on, our system is responding to it. So, and this causes elevation in stress hormones, which has lots of knock-on effects of immunosuppression, reproductive suppression, and lots of things that as I say, are well documented in mammals. Hearing damage, that's relatively unlikely, but it's still a concern, especially with accumulated noise over time that can lead to hearing damage. And then lastly, the most severe is strandings and morbidity and mortality. And there are examples of this, as I said, oftentimes in association with large sources like sonars, but also other sources as well. Okay, how do we mitigate it? The easiest way is to just reduce exposure. And there are several ways to do that. One is just to put less sound into the ocean. And so one of the things that we've worked on quite extensively with, for example, the oil and gas industry and the seismic industry, is to say, well, how loud of a source do you actually need to have to do the job? And we understand that the job needs to be done, but can we do it with a minimal amount of energy put into the water that is necessary? And this was not traditionally the way that they thought about this. They said, well, let's just use the biggest thing we can and get the maximum amount of data, which is understandable, but we've gotten more sophisticated than that, and we can use smaller sources. We can block or absorb sound at or near the surface. This is particularly in the relationship to pile driving and things like offshore wind. So that's also possible. There are other ways to do this, as I've listed. Separating noisy activities from important areas is an easy one. Changing the frequency range gets back to that early slide I showed of where the overlap is. If we can move the source out of the overlap area, we're able to mitigate some of the effects, certainly. Certainly, we should look at alternative sources, either of sound or other ways to do the job that we need to do. And then the last one is to be cognizant of the context of exposure, which can have a big impact on whether or not the animals are impacted. So they're more or less sensitive under different contexts of exposure, and we've come to learn about this. And that includes group or species-specific sensitivities. Okay, now I just wanted to spend some time on some mitigation strategies that we have developed over the years with a variety of collaborators. I'm only partially responsible for this work. This particular slide is part of a program that we put together as a proposal to the Department of Energy in the U.S. To look at the potential impacts of offshore wind development on wildlife. But the reason that I put it here is this cycle of monitoring and mitigation, as I put over there. The importance of feedback in improving our mitigation strategies through monitoring. So we're out there collecting data. We're employing mitigation strategies to prevent the dire things of injury or death. And then also understanding better those behavioral disruptions, potential behavioral disruptions, so we can then feed back in and make our mitigation strategies more sophisticated and more informed. So I don't want to go through all of these, but it involves synthesizing data, applying it to the animals, understanding the habitat and systems. We've gotten, in this area of statistics and modeling framework, we've gotten much more sophisticated in the last decade in terms of inputting various pieces of both animal data as well as acoustic data to understand and model out what it is we might be looking at, both from the individual perspective as well as from the population perspective, which is a very important point to bring out in that we are really focused on trying to limit the impacts on populations of animals. And then the last thing I wanted to develop was a group that we're putting together, I have put together, called the Global Alliance for Managing Ocean Noise. We saw a need and a niche for a group that is focused holistically. You can see our vision there is very simple: to achieve a quieter ocean where marine life and human use can thrive. And what we put in place importance on things like networks, representing the various stakeholders and having them involved, and looking at at creative, action-oriented, multi-sectoral ways of trying to get at these issues of ocean noise. And I just have a couple more slides just to bring out some of these ideas, but also to indicate the importance of them in mitigation. So we're an international partnership, including folks from industry, from resource managers, NGOs, policymakers, academics, obviously, to look for action-oriented solutions to this. So we really are trying to build networks of networks. And when we look at something like shipping, for example, looking at it holistically, can we quiet ships? Can we reroute ships? Can we do other things? Can we slow ships to allow the noise, again, to reduce those source levels and the amount of energy put into the ocean while still allowing activities to go ahead in a smart fashion? And we really want to drive those partnerships. We don't necessarily want to be involved in all of them, but make example or other connections that we can help to make are really one of the things we're after. We have some core goals. We want to scan the horizons and proactively identifying what potential concerns and also potential solutions are. Map those things, especially the emerging ones, on technology, policy, operational things that we can do to reduce the overall exposure. And then we want to create those dialogues according to our values and being progressive and collaborative and inclusive. We really are focused on action and actually creating solutions that can be implemented on national, on regional, on international scales. We're an international group of folks from several countries and several sectors, as I said, really focused on trying to understand and manage and mitigate ocean noise. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Doug. That was quite an eye-opener, actually, just realizing how far noise can travel in the oceans. And, keep take up there. I was at the GBIF. It's just the whole idea of sharing data and understanding, collaborating in the marine environment is as important as it is anywhere on the planet. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Mark Johnson, who's strategy lead for biodiversity and nature-based solutions at BP. Mark, please, over to you.
Excuse me. Great, thank you very much. So actually that's a really good segue into what I'm going to talk about in terms of underwater sound and what we've been doing. So if we go on to the first slide. So I'm Mark Johnson. I'm strategy lead in BP for biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Just coming on to that. Oh, sorry, you got the stick. Beg your pardon. That's all right. Not me. Great. So I'm going to talk very much about avoiding impacts in the first stage rather than restoration or minimization. And just through an example of work we've been doing in Sao Tome and Principe. So first of all, just a bit of background. I know many ecologists know about Sao Tome because it's well known for its biodiversity. So we acquired several years ago 2 offshore exploration blocks in the north and south of Sao Tome, the coast in West Africa. I should highlight first of all, straight up, we've now no longer involved in those blocks. We've actually sold them as part of our net zero strategy because we were sort of pulling out of new exploration for oil and gas. But anyway, it still represents a good example of mitigation we've put in place. So as part of that project, very early on, we did a high-level screening of biodiversity to understand what sensitivities are around that area, and that very, very quickly identified a number of key sensitivities, particularly in obviously around marine mammals. And particular study being done on humpbacks, and the areas around Sao Tome are being identified as potential calving areas for humpbacks, and it's been incorporated, but our focus very much just on the marine mammal side. So what we did, when we identified humpback straight away, potential calving, we invested in a 12-month research program long before doing the environmental impact assessment, right early on, to really understand much better about the sensitivities of humpbacks and other marine mammals around that area. So invested in a 12-month program. That involves some of the latest technology and monitoring underwater sound. 2 aspects was it. The primary focus is, 1, to identify presence-absence, but also understand some of the seasonal changes in the presence-absence of marine mammals. And identify key migration routes of marine mammals and also sea turtles as well, to understand what's actually going on around the oceans around Sao Tome. We employ 2 devices. First of all, deployed here, you can just about work them out on the right-hand side here, 2 fixed PAM monitors. They were in place for 12 months, continuously recording underwater sound to pick up vocalization by marine mammals. And the second one you can see in the bottom right hand on the photos here is something called the Autonaut. It's an automated vehicle, solar and wave powered, which has its own sort of challenges. It's actually steered by somebody here in the UK for operating offshore in Sao Tome. And again, it's continuously recording underwater sound. And you can see the route it was covering there, covering the northern areas, and that was out for several months, again, continuously monitoring, collecting data. We did have a few problems with local fishermen, but I can talk to you about that one later, because I'm obviously coming across this vehicle in the middle of the waters. So that's the program. It's a 6 months to really understand some of the seasonal changes there. A quick summary of the results. Collecting a huge amount of data for these observations, and we are still analysing some of that. I think this one, yeah. First of all, on the top there, you can just about work it out there. This is just a scatter showing when vocalization of humpbacks are being picked up, and each of those dots is a vocalization by a humpback whale. And you can see very clearly a very high concentration of dots when the mammals are there, and then it peters off, and then you've got a period where they're not present, because they've basically gone south out of the actual area itself. So it clearly identified a period then when we could undertake seismic surveys, which Doug has just been talking about, emphasising on the avoidance piece of when to do it. But of course, humpback's not the only species there. There are other species there as well. The middle diagram there is showing some of the other marine mammals which are present, and using the Autonaut, we're able to identify those hotspots where the key sort of feeding areas for some of the other marine mammals, the concentrations of marine mammals in that area, including beak whale. And then the sea turtles, we invested in a satellite tagging program with the local conservation group, which was great. We tagged hawksbill and green turtles. Purpose there was understand where they're going, what's their migration routes, and then what are they doing in the inter-nesting period, because a lot of the adults are hanging around the nests during the nesting period. How far are they going, and what are they doing during that period, again to help inform our mitigation program. And actually we found that turtles actually aren't moving very far at all. They're not going, they're staying within 20-metre water depth, usually no further than perhaps a kilometre from the actual nesting area, so they're staying very, very localised. And the other key point was understanding the nesting times, when the nesting key periods are, again, to help inform our mitigation plans. So this is a quick sort of snapshot. We're still analysing a lot of that data, and actually we think, or we hope, we've actually identified new species of beak whale. We're still getting that confirmed, but I hope to provide more details on that when it comes out in the scientific literature. So how do we use that information? Well, first of all, we committed to obviously just doing the seismic activities when the humpbacks are not there. So that's the first one in terms of the avoidance, between late June and late November. Keeping our activities away from the sea turtle nesting areas and the migration routes. So again, part of the avoidance measures. But also, of course, there's always a risk that humpbacks may come back early, or this may be seasonal variations. So what we also employed was monitoring, we call Sentinel PAM monitoring stations, which was monitoring while we were doing the seismic activities. So we could detect when marine mammals were coming back in, the humpbacks were coming back into the area, as an early warning signal for us, so we could then stop doing the seismic activities for that time. We also employed actually what I mentioned, actually go back to the first picture because it helps it slightly better. Normally, this sort of seismic activities, you employ one ship, one vessel to do the seismic. It would do one block, and then it would go on to do the next block. But again, we worked out, because of the schedule, we couldn't do that and fit it in with the avoidance schedule. So what we actually did was have deployment of 2 vessels. So that's twice the cost on the project to make sure we could fit it in within that seismic program, within that period. So I think that's where we are. In terms of, we also put exclusion zones around other marine mammal areas in terms of the hotspots, and applied both the JNC observations in terms of best practices, and actually extended our exclusion zones for shutdowns for some more in those areas of more marine sensitive areas. So summarising some of the challenges, first of all, I think we're quite lucky around Sao Tome. There was historical data, there was some scientific data out there which we could use. If we didn't have that, been much more difficult. So more generally in the marine, there is a lack of reliable and historical baseline data. Assessing the impacts, and we heard Doug talking about impacts on underwater sound, but actually understand what is the impact from the seismic sound waves on marine mammals. And there still is a lot of research to be done there, and particularly about the behavioral impacts. And over the last couple of days, we've heard a lot about net positive impacts. How do you achieve a net positive impact for behavioral impacts for marine mammals? If you've got an answer to that, let me know, and we can have further discussions on it. And then, until just the cost of undertaking detailed marine surveys, these things are not cheap. It'd be quite interesting how some of the new technology can be used to do better monitoring of marine mammals and other species in the marine environment. Okay, so that's me done. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Mark. I'm sorry I didn't give you that. That's excellent. So we have a really good example of one of the two actually of the stages of the mitigation hierarchy. And I'm going to now introduce Ricardo, who's going to come in from the Biodiversity Consultancy. Ricardo, what have you got to tell us today? And share some of your wisdom. Thanks very much. You may need that. So I'm going to move you on.
Put my presentation.
There we go, and that's your clicker. Okay.
This way works better. Do you hear me well? It's difficult to have this notion without without the headphones. So thank you very much for inviting the Biodiversity Consultancy and myself for this presentation. I'll very much focus and very briefly, because we have really short time for these short presentations in this whole session, in avoidance and mitigation of marine impacts caused by renewable offshore, so wind farms at offshore. And this is just a very short resume of what's in the guidelines that were launched this year by the IUCN and the Biodiversity Consultancy in January, and which I really suggest everyone interested to read, because it actually is a really very good document of all available, most updated information on impacts of offshore wind and how to mitigate them. And actually, it's not only the guidance is also about other type of renewables like onshore wind and solar. And this figure is actually taken out from this the guidance and tries to summarize the plethora of impacts that offshore wind can cause on biodiversity potentially, which is really a very diverse set of impacts. Most importantly, and to summarize, these are, of course, the destruction or degradation of the seabed, so impacting on marine habitats and all the species associated to them. But then also, of course, as we just heard in the two previous presentations, underwater sound can really impact strongly, especially on marine mammals, as we heard, but also on sea turtles or even fishes. Then, of course, we can have the increased risk of collisions with vessels due to increased traffic vessel, not only during the construction of the wind farms, but also during the operation and maintenance during the operational stage of the wind farms. And then above sea, we can have the risk of birds and bats collision with moving blades of the turbines, and or disturbance and displacement effects, so species that stop using the area due to the disturbance or due to the presence of the wind farm. And not to forget that there could also be impacts onshore associated to offshore projects, namely to birds, due to collision risk with transmission lines or electrocution risk of birds in distribution lines. So I'm not sure how familiarized you are with the mitigation hierarchy. It has already been addressed in previous presentations here. Basically, this is a set of actions that should be taken sequentially to mitigate as much as possible all impacts from, in this case, an offshore wind infrastructure. And so basically it includes the stages of avoidance first, as much as possible, especially by siting correctly, because most of the impacts of wind farms, even offshore, are very much site dependent. And then minimizing the impacts that still remain, then try to restore and rehabilitate as much as possible. But as it has already been said, in offshore, in the marine sea, that's really a really big challenge. It has to be proved that it works. And then finally, if there is some residual impacts that subsist after the application of the previous steps of the mitigation hierarchy, we should try to offset or compensate for those. And ultimately, the goal of all this application of the mitigation hierarchy should be no net loss in terms of biodiversity, or even a net gain, especially in terms of the priority biodiversity features. And it's extremely important to, especially to take action in the first step of the mitigation action, so of the mitigation hierarchy, so avoidance, because there will be an increasing risk of time lag between loss and compensation throughout the application of the whole mitigation hierarchy. There will be a decreasing in the trust and faith among stakeholders in the likelihood of success of application the mitigation hierarchy. There will be a decreasing in the probability of mitigation success and increasing in the uncertainty about the cost of mitigation options, and even a decrease in the options for mitigation, or a decrease in the time for correct any mistakes during the process. So as we should act as early as possible, and this is really using avoidance. And the most important stage for optimizing avoidance, as I said, is an early planning of siting the projects. And this, if possible, should be done by using sensitivity mapping and marine spatial planning. And then in a more micro scale, or a smaller scale, to the project scale, we should conduct early risk screening as well. So what is sensitivity mapping? Sensitivity mapping is basically to geographically represent the most important biodiversity features, especially those that are most sensitive, in this case, to offshore wind, such as could be colonies of threatened seabirds, the existence of KBAs of protected areas, congregatory areas or migratory routes, for instance, for birds. And the existence of these sensitivity maps would, of course, help developers to identify appropriate project site options very early in the planning, including no-go areas, to reduce the potential conflict with conservation stakeholders further ahead, to reduce risks related to regulation and access to lenders, and to reduce the assessment and mitigation costs. So it's a very important tool that it's not very widely available yet, but it's being more and more used and developed, fortunately. The other tool that can be available is marine spatial planning. This is another type of approach. It's not only using biodiversity maps, but also overlapping that with other features coming from the industry sides, like social, technical, wind availability, economic issues. And this can be informed, and this should be also associated with development of strategic environmental assessments. And it should also cover the whole set of infrastructures, offshore wind or others that can impact collectively on biodiversity. So this basically will result in more favorable areas to develop an offshore wind farm, and areas that are less favorable due to a set of reasons. And again, the use of these tools very early in the process will help developers to reduce risks and costs related to regulation, speed up permitting, speed up access to loans, for instance, to finance, reduce the uncertainty concerning biodiversity risk and mitigation options, reduce the need for more detailed scoping further ahead, and avoid conflict with conservation stakeholders. And finally, hopefully after all the sensitivity maps available and marine spatial planning have been used by a developer, they should conduct risk screening. There is an error there, not risk mapping, but risk screening at the early project stage as well. So this is basically overlay the spatial biodiversity data for the project area and around, for the area of influence, carrying out also a desktop literature review, to consult with experts, and then to identify risks for most important species in the project area or around it, and assess those risks against specific project standards such as PS6 IFC-PS6 standards. And this is, of course, helps developers to understand the implications of aligning with financial standards. This will inform mitigation planning as part of the project design, and this will scope the environmental social impact assessment and further field surveys that will be necessary for a specific area. Oops, sorry, want to go on, not back. So basically, sensitivity mapping and spatial planning should be used in a very early planning and site selection, so at a regional or national scale, whereas then, especially on the project, during the project design and more at the project scale, on more wider landscape or seascape scale, we should use risk screening to identify what risks we will have to face in this specific area that has been selected for a project, what would be the mitigation measures that should be taken. So finally, if a developer has access to a sensitivity map, he should of course choose areas that are not so sensitive, should choose the less sensitive areas for sensitive biodiversity. If he plans development plans in the areas that were selected to be more favorable, already taking into account both industry and biodiversity features. If he doesn't have access to any of these, and that's very much the case in many parts of our oceans, he should of course conduct efforts to obtain that spatial information at the wider possible scale. And then finally, at the project scale, to undertake risk screening to understand the project implications of a single project, but also of neighboring projects, and scope the environmental and social impact assessment and field surveys that he should conduct. I won't have time to go in examples of the successful application of the mitigation hierarchy offshore, but this is just to remind you that there are plenty of good examples that are in the guidelines that I mentioned in the first slide that were launched by IUCN and TBC earlier on. This was a long and collaborative process between IUCN, TBC, many conservation NGOs and the private sector. Apart from these are available, of course, in the links I leave here. And apart from the guidance, the guidelines themselves, there are already some industry guidance notes for early screening of biodiversity risks that I really recommend all of you to read. Thank you very much.
Ricardo, thanks so much. That was fascinating. And I think, a couple of takeaways for me is the need for spatial context, so your strategic environmental assessment, and other users in the seascape. We've touched on two quite well-known industries right now, but I'd like to see what happens with fisheries. Do they take the same approach? I don't think so. So that I'm going to leave for the discussion. To introduce Isabel now, please do come up. Here's your clicker. Can I move you on? And Isabel with the Capitals Coalition.
Thank you very much. So we've just heard three in fact, technical and detailed examples of avoiding and mitigating risk in the marine sector. I'm going to zoom right out. It's great that some people are already doing this, but a lot of people are not. And so this Capitals approach is a way for more businesses, more organizations to start also measuring and valuing their impacts on the ocean. So I work at the Capitals Coalition. We are a global collaboration that aims to redefine the value so that businesses, government and finance are using the value of natural, social and human capital in their decision making. We do primarily work with businesses and we have hundreds of case studies and only 2 of them are from the ocean. So it is really, really striking in the work that we do how little involvement we have with the ocean, and this is something that we really want to change because, of course, ocean-based businesses are just as dependent on natural capital and on social capital and human capital, and they are impacting just as much. So this is what we're working towards, just to make sure that we are all on the same page about what we mean by the capitals. Traditionally, we've always thought of the capitals as meaning money, produced capital, but in fact a capital is anything that provides value and benefits to people and society, and therefore we have to also include natural capital, which is nature, social capital, which is the shared norms and networks of belief amongst people, and human capital, which is the individual's attributes and how that can bring value. We've got to include these when we're considering the capitals. It's important to consider this because the value of capitals can help you in decision making that is more complete than just looking at produced capital. And this is what we call the capitals approach. I won't go into too much detail about what this is because of the time that we have, but it's basically the idea that we're not only measuring the impact that we have on nature and people, but we're also looking at the dependency, which really gives the business case for protecting the environment, because if a business is dependent on nature, then it's going to look after it because it makes business sense. We don't only measure these impacts and dependencies, but we also value them, so give them more context than just the measurement. And finally, not only looking at an issue in isolation, but considering it as part of a system is really a cornerstone of the capitals approach. To put that into a little bit more of a context, let me walk you through what we would call our conceptual model, which is that every business impacts and depends on the capitals. This impact and dependency leads to costs and benefits to business and society. Understanding these costs and benefits make evident what the risks and opportunities for the business is. And that means that we can either mitigate these, avoid them, or make the most of the opportunities that are present to us. An example for an impact. So let's say that a company has a batch of contaminated seafood because they've had a problem during their processing. That is an impact of a business. What this causes is a cost to society, which is that there's illness in their consumers. That results in a risk for the business, which is of course a financial risk and a reputational risk because no one's going to buy products that's going to make them ill. And also regulatory, they could get into a lot of trouble for that. The same is true for dependencies. Let's say that a business has got a dependency on stable fish stocks because they're a fishery company, so they need to have stable fish stocks. They are, as a result of realizing this dependency, they decide to support a local MPA so that over time they have a more stable supply. Of course, what this means is that that is an operational opportunity. Because they recognize this dependency, they were able to do something about it, which means in the long term they will be able to continue profitably. As I mentioned before, rather than just measuring the impact, we're also going to be looking at valuing it. And the way that we would do this is to, first of all, identify what the impact is, measure that impact, then look at, as a result of that impact, what capitals are changing and how much are they changing. And from that, you can measure and value what the consequence is for people. Because when you can look at it in relation to people, that's when the value becomes more meaningful. And you're able to make more informed decisions based on that value, which can be monetary, but it could also be qualitative or quantitative. So as I said, there are many terrestrial-based businesses that are doing this approach already. And this is a brand new case study that we only got sent last week of an MPA in Mallorca that has just carried out a natural capital assessment to work out what their contribution to the economy was. So they actually have created a new accounting system for a network of MPAs in Mallorca so that over time they can show what the MPA's contribution is to the local economy. And they found this great number, which is that for every euro that is invested annually into an MPA, it yields 10 euros return. And so that's a really, really clear communication tool for them to really, within policy, try to get resources allocated to them. And it's also very useful for them in long-term evaluation of the impacts. Every year they can do these studies more and be able to compare about how they're progressing. So yes, so this, as I said, is a new example, but we need many more. I'm going to skip over that one. So, To apply Capital's approach, the coalition has put together a number of protocols bringing together all of the different people who work in this field. Our first one was the Natural Capital Protocol, which was published in 2016, followed by the Social and Human Capital Protocol, which came a couple of years later. And then in 2020, we took the Social and Human Capital Protocol, the Natural Capital Protocol, and we brought them together for the agricultural sector, which are the TEEB Agri-Food Operational Guidelines for Business. And they all follow this 4-step framework, which allows us to measure and value these impacts and dependencies on nature and people, and they're very easy to follow for businesses and very applicable. But what we need is one for the oceans. We need to take the unique landscape and the unique conditions that exist within the ocean and adapt this guidance to it. This is work that has not yet started, but is really, really essential so that we can also include nature-based businesses, ocean-based businesses, into this conversation, because at the moment there are only a few that are doing this and we need to get everyone on board. This is the work that we're proposing at the moment, and I think it's interesting to think that although the Capitals approach is a framework that's applicable to everywhere, everything, any situation, it can also help to tackle very specific issues. And I think sometimes we get a little bit caught up in the process, and actually it would be really interesting to be able to generate some evidence about how a capitals approach can address the biggest issues that are facing the sustainable ocean economy today. I've picked out a couple here. There are obviously many more. We were talking just now about marine spatial planning. It would be very interesting to apply a capitals approach to a marine spatial planning situation where you can actually include valuation in that management of trade-offs, which gives more context to the situation and gives a more complete information with which to inform those decisions. One topic that's very, very interesting at the moment, a lot of people are talking about it, is the idea of funneling investment into ocean-based activities. So if we're really going to tackle some of these issues, we're going to need a substantial amount of funding to go into them. I'm thinking here of bivalve production, more sustainable fish farms. These are sometimes small businesses that aren't that visible to investors. The capitals approach can help you to collect the robust data that is needed for, that investors need in order to risk profile an investment. So it's a very useful tool for both the small businesses and also the bigger investment companies to collect the data to make sure that they're really doing their risk analysis properly. Climate targets, obviously everyone needs to be playing their part in terms of business to achieve our climate ambitions. Shipping accounts for 90% of global trade, and although there are some great targets within the shipping industry, if we can really shift that industry, we'll be much further ahead with our climate targets. And the capitals approach can help you to set those targets because it allows you to look at your whole value chain and identify bits in it that are not as efficient and that could be more efficient and allow you to track what your target could be there. And finally, not forgetting the dependency that exists of so many people on the ocean around the world, and a capitals approach can really help to push forward this idea of equity and prosperity for communities that are reliant on the ocean, notably looking through comparing different options for alternative livelihoods, and specifically thinking of ecotourism in that context. What alternative livelihoods could exist other to fishing or more destructive practices, and it allows you to profile these different options and give really the value that it would create for nature and for people. Just one final slide about what we're trying to do at the Coalition. We're trying to get this really in gear because we need more evidence for how businesses impact and depend on the oceans, both for the ocean's benefit and actually for the long-term prosperity of the businesses that depend on the ocean. We're hoping to carry out some best practice examples of this, and also to really bring in ocean-based businesses into this conversation because, as I said, at the moment they are lagging behind, and we've got to act on this now. We're currently engaging with partners, and if you're interested in joining this program or in talking with us more about it, please do ask me some questions. Yes, that's what I've got. Thank you.
Fantastic, Isabel, and thanks for, yeah, there we go. Right, if I could ask you actually to stay up and grab a chair, I'm going to move. If Mark, if you could, and Ricardo come in, and we'll get Doug in from on Zoom from his remote location. What we're going to do is just have a quick discussion. I think there's some key takeaways which have come through from all our speakers, really, which actually need to be applied beyond just the renewable sector or the energy sector. And certainly, you picked up, Isabel, the need to think about the fisheries sector. There are so many other users of our oceans, so it's a busy space. So strategic planning or spatial planning is one of the starting points for that, but you end up with competition and conflict very often between users. So how do you both optimize that and avoid those cumulative impacts that we've heard about, but equally, how do you work with them to help resolve those problems and actually work together? Because, Mark, you may find that in the energy sector you have a fisheries partner that's helping to achieve some of the things that they need to change in order to kind of create a better outcome for the ocean health and ocean function. And similarly in the energy sector we've got the renewable sector we've got local fishers or we've got a whole lot of different parties who are participating in this. So I think that's one sort of key thing. But I wanted to ask, really, I think some say that if you just leave the ocean alone it'll recover. So but that's not going to be possible. So Mark, I'm going to start with you and just ask, beyond the mitigation, how do you see this applying from to some of the other sort of environments and other species? Because you've mentioned two. There is this whole, how much data, you talked about getting a lot of data there. It was very, very qualitative. You could prove what was going on and you could really defend your activities. But there are a lot of stakeholders who will say, you need more, you need it somewhere else. So how would you approach, just how much data is enough and what one does with it?
Myself. So, no, great question. I think it's, there's never always enough data, of course. That's always a challenge, but I think we do often hang up a little bit in terms of data, I think, because, we could say, we need more data, and it can put off actually doing the work we need to do in the actions. So getting that balance is quite critical. Yeah, we need to have sufficient data to inform intuitive decisions in our actions, but I think that really emphasised the importance of monitoring our activities and continuously monitoring and collecting baseline data beyond just the typical baseline we do for environmental impact assessments. I think we certainly need to improve the baseline data collections. And for the example I gave there in Sao Tome, that was quite the exception because we knew we were in a sensitive area, therefore we spent 12 months collecting baseline data. We wouldn't do that everywhere. But I think now in terms of the nature positive approach and methodology, we will have to be doing that everywhere. So I think there's going to be quite a change and quite a big shift that we're going to have to be collecting a lot more baseline data. And to be able to do that, we're going to have to work with different sectors. We are increasingly seeing like the wind farms, offshore seismic activities, etc. You're going to have to be joining up and sharing data because it's much more economical to do that. So I think there's a lot of areas to do and working with other communities.
That's brilliant. And I'm going to ask Ricardo, how, just picking up on these different users in the marine space, the different activities that are going, how do you think we can actually work with these other players to actually help deliver on the projects? Because as a conservation NGO, we're often the ones who've been asked to implement projects for companies or for activities or big infrastructure projects that are potentially having an impact. So how do you propose going about finding, delivering those projects in the marine environment? Who should we work with, and how does an NGO like us, build our capacity to actually deliver these?
It's quite a logistic to reply to anything here. Yeah, okay. The marine environment is even more complex. To do that in the onshore is already complex, I would say, but in the marine environment rises other challenges very difficult to address. And as you were saying, so that there will be overlapping activities, other economic activities in any area, or practically any area that is proposed to develop renewable energies at the ocean, especially fisheries. And so there's a whole set of stakeholders that should be engaged in any special planning, because there will be always people complaining that, well, if you are just developing a renewable energy infrastructure here, where can we fish? Because there will be also limitations for them to fish within wind farms. If there is, for instance, from sensitivity maps, if there is biodiversity issues, a set of other economic activities can be avoided as well. I didn't mention, but actually some of the interesting part of at least some offshore wind is that it can actually result in also some positive impacts to biodiversity, namely because they can act as a kind of artificial reefs to be colonized by mollusks or crustaceans, and then to a whole associated marine fauna afterwards. And this has been already trialed, especially in the North Sea, by the Belgium and Dutch authorities with quite a lot of success. So there is kind of a win-win aspect in this in some areas. If some more relevant biodiversity aspects are avoided, there can be actually positive impacts for other economic sectors as well. I think for NGOs, the role is to also to engage very early in the process with all the possible stakeholders that we can envisage that will have something to do with that area, either in terms of economic or, well, everything has to do with the economic. I was thinking about direct fisheries or so, but also in terms of tourism or landscape impacts, whatever. And to make them see that biodiversity is also a very important feature. Often in the marine environment, it's underwater, so it's even more difficult to assess its importance. Yeah. Often I would say that local communities would understand much better on shore that, well, yes, we see birds here. Can this wind farm impact birds? But at sea, it's far away, it's underwater marine fauna, so it's very difficult to have awareness on this. And I think NGOs have a really crucial role in this awareness, in raising this awareness for all the community.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much. I mean, I think, you know, there will be many NGOs here and involved in the Congress who will be a little bit reluctant to engage in these types of projects because there is a risk to working with business. You may not always agree with what's going on. So that kind of step into actually, I guess, becoming a constructive collaborator and a partner actually is a big one for some organizations, but I think it's a very necessary one. I'm going to come to Doug. Thank you for joining us, and good evening to you. No, very good morning early in the States. So thanks, and it's nice to actually have you here live. Thanks for your presentation earlier. I got to talk to you over there, I've been told. So Doug, I've got a question that it relates. So yours was quite had some technical solutions, and you know, how fast is technology moving? You suggested alternative technologies. You suggested ways of sort of impact mitigation through solving that, because obviously sound is sound in the ocean, and it, as you've pointed out, travels extraordinary distances and has, you know, multiple implications for the marine ecosystem. So where is technology going, and you know, can we be hopeful that there will be alternatives? Because, you know, determining where an oil or a mineral resource is under the ocean is not so easy to do without seismic. So where is technology going, and on the mitigation side too? I'll come to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, and so sorry not to be able to join you in person, and I very much appreciate you putting together this technical solution so that I can join. I would put the technology in a couple of different categories. One is certainly the reduction of the sound source itself, which I mentioned in the presentation. And so there is a technology called Vibrasize that is really coming on board that it's still putting sound into the ocean, but it's doing it at a much more targeted frequency range, which is part of the message there, is trying not to overlap too many species. So that's certainly one possibility. The other way I would say the technology is helping, well, a couple others actually. One is in our ability to measure and understand the potential impacts on animals. So that comes from drones, which are not an answer to everything, but also passive acoustic, our capabilities in passive acoustics for understanding where animals are and how they're potentially being impacted by those sound sources. And really just the reduction of the sound sources themselves, again, we're just to use the Sakhalin example, we've been pushing Sakhalin energy for years to reduce the sound source as far as absolutely possible, and actually have them shooting a few lines with a reduced sound source just to actually get some data on this to see if that would help. So unfortunately, as you said, there's no magic bullet to completely removing sound from the equation, because it is such an incredibly effective tool for probing the ocean, the waters itself, and then underneath. So the last thing I'll say about technology is I would say on more of a software side. So in addition to reducing the sound sources and then sensing where the animals are and what the animals are doing, we also have the sort of software and model approach to understanding of the impacts on populations. And so feeding more data into those things, so we don't have the everlasting need for more and more data, which of course as scientists, that's what we do, is collect data and interpret it. But at the same time, being able to plug that data in more effectively and more efficiently to then understanding the potential impacts and how to plan for them. So it's more than just reducing sound. I did mention the other ideas for reducing sound in terms of buffering it. But there are quite a few, and there's some references out there I'd be happy to point folks towards if that would help.
Thanks very much, Doug. And I think a lot of what you say can apply to other disturbances or impacts that are felt within the marine environment. I'm now going to turn to Isabel, and I'm going to pick up on your the concept of capitals, but also looking at the multiple benefits that come from the different users, or from the ecosystem as ecosystem services. So if we take a nature-based solutions approach, it's a similar sort of thing. I mean, what we're trying to do is find values, and actually trying to find a more integrated way of approaching management of our ocean systems. So just to pick that up, you say identify ecosystem services. That's the dependencies that people have, but also the operations. Fisheries have a huge dependency, and they're getting the fish for free, basically. So that's I'm sorry to pick on fisheries, but I think it's worth picking on them. But can you just reflect a little bit around, a bit more around the nature-based solutions aspect of working with these different sectors to maintain and build or rebuild and recover natural capital within our oceans?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is that a lot of the time businesses have not considered a nature-based solution as one of the things that will answer a risk that they have. So I'm thinking of a particular example of a company that had a pipeline in Alaska, and the pipeline was becoming increasingly damaged by waves, sort of wind storm surges. And so they were thinking, well, we should build a wall to protect this pipeline against this increasing storm surges. And they did an assessment, and they were trying to work out what alternative options there were. And that's one of the and what they decided to do, in fact, was build or put in oyster walls rather than actual cement walls. So by taking the time to identify what the actual overall objective, what the overall benefits of creating a wall versus an oyster wall, allowed them to actually not only improve the water quality around where their pipeline was, but also not impact it by putting more cement in that beautiful area. So yes, it is. Nature-based solution ties in very closely to it, because it is often the best solution for business, not only for their business, but also for nature.
Thanks very much. And I think that leads, to some of the comments that have come through as well around how we need to think about the role the ocean plays in our climate regulation, but equally, are there things that we can put in place that may contribute to climate sequestration? I'm thinking of things like kelp beds and which are actually a fundamental part of our blue carbon economy, and but also are providing extraordinary input into revitalizing our fisheries, revitalizing just the basic ecosystem health as a whole. we've got 10 minutes left. I just want to check, Leo or anyone, are there any questions online that I need to kind of give space to, or can I just go into something which I think is a big challenge in the mitigation and or applying the mitigation hierarchy in the marine space, and that's around compensation and the offset piece, because certainly I would imagine, there certainly in the renewables guidance there's offsets discussion. In our 2 books there are offsets discussions, and we know for certain activities that it's non-offsettable. So for deep sea mining it's non-offsettable. There are certain types of seabed mining at shallow waters which are offsettable, or not offsettable, but that can achieve a harm outcome because of natural restoration, because of the time frames and the spatial frames you're talking about. But then we'll look at the sorts of activities that that we're familiar with. Let's just take energy sector, whether it's renewables or more conventional energy. How in this big 3 dynamic space, highly dynamic, where things move, things come and go. I mean, noise travels across the entire ocean. How do we approach this? And, can we resolve something where actually, the traditional approach to a net positive impact in a sort of accounting process is about a like for like or a like for equivalent or trading up to better. And where do we go, and can we resolve this with equivalencies? Can we contribute to protecting marine or increasing marine protected areas? Can we contribute to the health of the ocean? Can we help to reduce other pressures on the ocean, which can legitimately be part of this whole equation? Because I genuinely feel that's necessary. We have to think this through. Mark, can I start with you?
Thanks so much. No, first of all, you absolutely rightly highlight the challenges of working in the marine environment, and actually restoration offset isn't possible in many of these projects. And at the moment, a lot of the offset and restoration aspects you consider wouldn't normally contribute towards a net positive impact or a net positive target. You have that. So I just echo. So absolutely right. So I think we do have to challenge perhaps some of our more conventional approaches we take on the terrestrial environment for the marine and offshore, because investing in marine protected areas are absolutely one of them. Coastal restoration, mangrove restoration activities, again, they may not be attributed to the specific project activity or the impacts, but overall, in the wider landscape, they probably do contribute towards a net gain. So I think we just have to look at things differently in the marine environment to what we have in the terrestrial environment. Now, that may be controversial.
A capitals approach?
But quite possibly, yes. Or a landscape approach, seascape approach, more capital approach, but I think we just have to accept that aspect. Now, of course, we have to avoid certain impacts, we have to reduce other impacts in the marine environment, but we're going to have to think slightly differently in that aspect. That may be controversial. And the other aspect to it which comes to mind was in terms of the whole Rigs to Reef program, and then actually you may not get the benefits for 30 years' time by creating offsets from rigs, and that's what, now again, it's quite controversial. But again, it may be at different time horizons. So
fantastic. Well, I'm voting ecological compensation process. Brett, let's see what Ricardo has to say on this matter.
Well, first of all, I'd like to come back to my main message that offset is really like the last resort that we should think of. And that's why actually, because as Mark said, and that as we all have been saying, that the environmental ocean is extremely complex, and that's why the mitigation hierarchy raises different challenges than onshore. And that makes even more important to avoid really important areas and not to put our actions more up front on offset, for instance. But if we have to go there, if after all avoidance possible, after all minimization and restoration possible, we still have to try to offset some residual impacts. I would agree that it would make sense in some, at least in, well, probably in many cases, to try to compensate in other areas much further away than those that are being impacted. So like investing or helping, supporting real effective protection of marine MPAs or EPSAs. So there are already some knowledge. The marine environment still lacks lots of knowledge, even about impacts. Yep. But there is already some good knowledge on really important areas in the ocean that should that is a real protection, effective protection, that it's not even close to get, that they are not even close to get that type of protection. And so I would say that offsets maybe could or should actually be more focused in those areas often, even though this could be also strange for a developer, for instance, in the strange concept to be paying for compensation somewhere else, maybe in a different ocean, but that could make sense actually. So again, this should be already in another. There's still lack of data, it's true, but we should be already in a different stage of this discussion, where spatial planning around the world has been already made, good sensitivity maps available everywhere, and so we would not have actually this discussion anymore. We would know exactly what areas should be, in what areas should offshore wind be concentrated, in what areas should be left out totally and designed for conservation purposes mostly.
That's fantastic. I'm not going to dump you with that one. That's fine. Doug, do you have anything to add on that, or shall I sort of move on? I'm conscious we've got literally 5 more minutes. Anyone from the audience like to ask a question? Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Doug, just a sec. While
I did that. Okay.
Yeah, you make a comment and then you can ask your question. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, just quickly, building off one thing I did say, and then also the risk prioritization that's been going on as part of the Western Grey Whale Advisory Panel and Justin Cook's work to really rank those risks and prioritize the effort on offsets, which I know is very difficult to do. But I also, just quickly on the technology side, is that the investment in some of these technologies, while we can all debate about whether it's an offset or not. If investing in other things can be part of an offset, then I think there are avenues and there are ways to spend that investment that could be used to offset future impacts.
Fantastic. Thanks, Doug. Right, please. Thank you. Do you want to just introduce yourself and then ask your question?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, thank you.
My name is Teresa Gamito. I'm a consultant, and I've just finished the Maritime Spatial Plan for Mozambique.
Fantastic.
And we have a lot of everything is happening there,
Yes.
but we don't have that much information. I would love to have all of you giving comments when we did the plan, because we have not wind energy, but marine waves and so on, energies. We have the gas, we have not yet the mining, seabed mining, but we have already coastal mining. It was very difficult to deal with that because, for instance, where is the pilot project for marine energy? There is also the place for marine mammals. And we tried to have some guidelines, but I would love a lot to have more information
That's fine. Let's have a chat afterwards, and yes,
okay.
because we've been involved with that North Mozambique River Reform project, so it's a fascinating one too, and there's a lot more development. Does anyone have a comment? But yes, I guess we'll all be happy to have a chat afterwards. Sure, thank you. Anyone else got any questions? Right. Well, I think sort of some of the key messages. I think we're sort of done. I won't put you under any more pain or pressure. Thanks very much for your attendance. Key messages, I think, are avoid impacts and minimize. You want to go? And avoid. And but actually that it's complicated, but not so complicated that you shouldn't do anything about it. So good data is important. Good technology. Think about it, give it enough time. So there's spatial, temporal components of the marine environment are hugely important. Let's share what we find so that others can learn and we can build on that knowledge. Let's understand that because it's a continuous environment and it's contiguous with other users, that we need to collaborate across sectors, that those sectors and those communities, whether it's a small fisher community on the coast, can help us to deliver our objectives if we're trying to aim for enhancing nature, contributing to nature positive, achieving net positive impact, achieving net gain for an IFC compliant project, whatever it might be, that there are those users. So there's a whole community, a whole infrastructure, a whole ecology of institutions and individuals that need to be part of trying to deliver on that. So, yes, the consultants need to come and talk to the NGOs too, and the businesses, so those collaborations are important. But thanks for your time today. Hope you found something useful in that, and thank you very much to my panel, who were brilliant, and, came from abroad. So thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.